Hi there. So rather than bash off something initially, some initial opinions, which you will actually find in Citywire if you want to read my initial take on the budget, this is a bit more of a considered take on what's actually happened, and I'm going to talk about the reaction in the tradies and so on and so forth as well. Right, so like any budget statement, I'm going to split it down into four sections. But just in general, this week's been, the last few weeks have been a bit tough, as work's been coming in gradually, but the business is more or less where I want it to be. And we're slightly ahead of budget at the moment, which is quite nice. And speaking of the budget, I've been trying to write something up about it for a while now, but I've struggled really because it doesn't add up. There's just something weird about it, and I feel like I'm missing something big. That something could be the raft of funding required to actually work towards what we agreed to at COP27. But instead we have electric cars being taxed more and energy companies being incentivised to drill for more oil and gas, which seems a bit contradictory. Perhaps it's the new team to target part-time workers and remove universal credit if they don't go up to full-time without any consideration that a lot of these will be single mums juggling, earning enough to feed their kids and not spending too much on childcare, which wipes out their earnings. Either that or they'll likely be disabled. The disabled that have recently been told they're fit to work when they probably aren't, and have been given a charitable job in a hairdresser's sweeping hair for a few hours a day, for instance. Maybe it's the fact that my clients and I will all likely pay more taxes next year, and for what? Billions in fraud the Conservatives decided not to investigate, billions on a woefully inadequate response to COVID, billions on the self-imposed economic sanctions that have been the Johnson Brexit deal. Not to say that Brexit always was a bad idea, just largely likely to be. Billions on locking down the economy rather than locking down the borders, and billions on a month-long economic experiment by Kwasi Kwarteng. And I really resent paying for all these things, as A, I voted the buggers in to do something different in 2015, and have basically spoiled my ballot ever since, and B, they were warned about all this beforehand and did what they wanted to, as opposed to that which the experts told them. But anyway, this video is going to cover the four key areas of the budget: what this means to people, what it means to businesses, what the economic impact might be, and what the political choices have been, i.e. what might the opposition have done. Personal taxation. Well, so the top rate of tax is still 45%, but the threshold has been reduced from 150,000 to 125,140. So this means that the bands of tax are basically 0 to 12,570, 0%, 12,571 to 50,270, 20%. And there's about 50 grand to about 100 grand, 40%, 100 grand to about 125 is 60%, and then 125-ish plus is 45%. So you got that weird 60% band. The reason that's there is because as soon as you hit 100,000, they start to withdraw your personal allowance. So the effective rate is 60%. It's not actually 60, although it is effectively. Anyway, they've reduced the dividend allowance from $2,000 a year to $1,000 a year from next April, and £500 per person from April 2024. That's the amount of dividends you can earn without paying tax on them. However, this will, according to the budget documents, this will cost the country £30 million next year. I don't understand how increasing taxes can operate at a cost to the exchequer, but anyway. And will only raise 450 million quid in future years. So obviously, 450 million quid is a lot of money. However, it's not really that much money in the context of a national budget. It's quite a small amount of money. So it doesn't seem to be very impactful. And given the people that it's most likely to impact are those reliant on dividends in their retirement, it just seems to be a pensioner's tax. Yes, they've kept the idiotic child tax credit charge. So a person who earns between 50 to 60,000 pays their child tax credit back. The reason it's idiotic is that it's based on one person rather than household. So a household where one person earns, let's say, £85,000 and the other person earns 15, they get no child tax credit. And remember the bands? So between 50 and 85, this person's paid 40% tax. So net household income is lower than two individuals both earning 50 grand. And also there's two individuals earning 50 grand get their... So not only have they got more household income because of just income tax bands, they've also got the child tax credit, which is even more impactful. So it's a stupid tax, and I don't know why they're keeping it. It doesn't really raise that much either. It's just taxing parents where one person's earning a lot and the other one isn't. They've not cancelled IR35. That's something that Kwasi Kwarteng was talking about. So they've backpedaled on that particular rule. The IR35 was a rule that was basically designed to stop employers forcing their employees into a quasi-self-employed state, i.e. removing employment rights and so on and so forth. It did have, I nearly said unintended consequences. I think they were intended, but the consequences, as in these are natural consequences that were worth the pain, as it were. It has affected people like lorry drivers who are quite often more or less self-employed and can do contracts for a whole variety of employers and ultimately end up only working for one employer. So that's a bit of a downside to that particular IR35 rule. And there are other people who have been affected, unjustly so, however. The budget's reduced the capital gains tax threshold, the annual exempt amount, to £6,000 next year, and then reducing to £3,000 the year after. And so what this means is that people who make money through growth assets are going to pay much more in tax, and this will negatively impact people selling property that isn't at the main residence. This measure is also unwinding a long-standing Conservative policy to increase this threshold over time, so that's interesting. And I'll play you Beth Rigby's comments on it later, and that she confirms why that's interesting. Anyway, they've kept the inheritance tax thresholds locked in at $325,000 until 2028 at the earliest, which means in real terms they're expecting to recoup a lot of money in inheritance tax. And Jeremy Hunt has put more funding into the IHT avoidance team, so they're going to be doing more investigations on marginal cases. So make sure you've got your wills absolutely buttoned down. They're currently reviewing the state pension age increase timescale again, which also affects public sector workers, because a lot of public sector workers have pensions which have a bit that's called CARE, which is Career Average Revaluated Earnings. And normally those benefits you get to retire at the state pension age. So if they increase the state pension age, what happens to those pensions? Because that's technically a pay cut, legally a pay cut to those employees, because you're reducing their remunerative package by forcing them to retire later. So it'll be interesting to see if they do, again, put back the state pension age, what impact that has on public sector workers. Overall, though, allowances have been frozen or reduced, essentially levying real terms taxes on all of us to the tune of billions of pounds. Again, there's an article we'll look at in a second that puts that in numbers. Business taxation. So what's the impact on businesses? Well, the windfall tax on companies like BP and Shell has been extended until March 2028. It was due to end, I think, April next year. And the rate has been extended to 35% of eligible profits, and they're introducing a similar 45% on electrical generators like British Gas, etc. So we've had some profiteering by the oil producers. We've had a lot of profiteering in the energy distribution sector, so they're doing a windfall tax on those companies as well to take those profits back. However, they've kept this strange offsetting mechanic whereby if these companies just drill more oil, then they end up paying no windfall taxes. I'll talk about that again later onto the political bit. The annual investment allowance is up to £1 million from April 2023, which might not be that helpful, as energy bills over winter are going to be of most concern to most businesses. So allowing larger companies to buy bigger bits of kit is not tremendously helpful in terms of tackling the cost of energy over this winter, and it's not particularly helpful from an economic perspective going forwards, because our economy is mostly services. So helping large industrial companies to buy large bits of equipment, there's not that many bridges being built in the UK, right? Corporation tax increases that were scrapped in the growth plan a couple of months ago are back on the agenda. So the small profits amount is 50 grand, so you pay 19% on that. And then between 50 and 500, you pay 26.5%. And on profits over 500,000, you get charged 25%. The reason for the 26.5% band is basically what they're doing is they're taxing you a bit more on that £450,000, such that when you get to 500,000, you've paid effectively 25% on the whole of it. So you kind of have to catch up a little bit. I disagree with that because it's not progressive. Progressive taxation seems fairer, but anyway. Which, the current personal allowances are not progressive. They're kind of all over the place. It's a mess. There's also very little else for businesses. There's been some reliefs extended on business rates and national insurance and all this kind of stuff, sort of tail end of COVID stuff that's been rolled over seemingly without any thought or purpose. But there's been no fundamental business rate reform. That was something that the Conservatives have been promising for years and haven't really done. So that's a bit frustrating, but that's about it for business. There's not really that much in the budget apart from the economic stuff, which is what we're going to talk about now. So the economic impact: unwinding the growth plan will raise £4.5 billion this year and 20 billion or so for the next every year for the next few years. So that was going to be, Kwasi Kwarteng's budget was going to be very expensive, and they've confirmed the costs here. There are a whole host of packages which are sort of flavoured green, as in environmental. However, the impact of these seems to be unclear and just future promises that they don't have to deliver on. So, for instance, the Energy Efficient Task Force has historically been given £6.6 billion in previous years to improve energy efficiency in the United Kingdom, and has seemingly had very limited effect. This task force has been given another £6 billion. But honestly, for a country pumping human poo into the seas, rendering a lot of our beaches actually toxic to swim in, it seems like this is a political and an ineffective policy pledge statement, whatever. They are attempting a potentially inhumane policy called the in-work progression offer, which will support those on universal credit to increase their earnings. Essentially, those part-time workers on universal credit will have to go to interviews at the job centre to justify why they are part-time. Again, single mums, people on disability, etc., etc. People who are disabled but don't qualify for the current disability benefits because they've been told they can work by the company that does that. Company, not department. Anyway, they're also investing £280 million in a team in the Department of Work and Pensions to tackle error, fraud and debt across the benefit system. So essentially they've got the gatekeepers to universal credit coming in with the in-work progression offer, and this team at DWP who are essentially enforcers for those who dare to be unfortunate. The energy profits levy, or windfall tax, is still a bit of a joke. I did quite like Rishi's idea that the levy was accompanied with an investment allowance, meaning that if big energy companies just spent that money on sustainable energy transition, like if they just bought more solar and wind and so on and so forth, they got to keep those profits. That made sense to me. However, I misread that policy that Rishi came up with in, I think it was February this year. Because it turns out the investment allowance essentially relates to any investment. So drilling new sources essentially allows them to deduct that exploratory cost from turnover and also from this windfall tax, this levy. So the levy's not. I think Keir Starmer keeps asking Rishi at PMQs why like BP hasn't paid any windfall tax yet, despite making 20 billion of excess profits. I can't remember the actual figures, but it's obviously the policy's not working. I think, Labour's idea here is to use all the windfall taxes instead of allowing the big energy companies to do it. They'd start a new company owned by the public, so owned by the Exchequer, that just does energy transition, owned by the public, which seems to me like a better idea, because if the private sector isn't going to do it, the government has to, right? The biggest economic impact will be that which faces businesses over winter, as many have gone bust already because of energy tariffs ending and companies not being able to afford to renew their contracts. And this is a pattern that will probably continue over winter, as there does seem to be very little help with bills. I mean, the government have pledged some money, but they're very, very sketchy on how that's going to be applied, how you get hold of it, etc., etc. So I'm concerned that this sounds a bit like a lot of their big pots of money for COVID, in that there's very little definition, and it's quite concerning as to how that money's actually going to get out there. So yeah, these measures proposed here are more or less the equivalent of striking up the bassoon whilst the Titanic is sinking. Political choices. A very Tory thing. Hunters announced an efficiency and savings review. Their party's opinion of the public sector is well known, and it seems more austerity is coming because of this review. That said, they have promised to give a real terms increase, and this is the good news, a real terms increase to healthcare and social department spending by 3.7%. So what that means is those departments go up by the 10 or 11% that inflation is, and an additional nearly 4%. Now, there is a massive backlog in the NHS. It's worse than it was in 1998, possibly ever since records began. And it needs a lot more than inflation plus 4% realistically. However, that's a good start. Obviously, education is really important, so I like that. They're increasing government spending across all departments, but frankly, this is well behind inflation. And also cutting how they're funding this is interesting, because they've basically got rid of the 75 billion budget to pay for COVID. So last year we spent £75 billion on COVID intervention. This year we're going to spend nothing on COVID directly, and all that money's being recycled back into other departmental budgets, which is a bit weird, because I'm not sure what they spent £75 billion on COVID last year on, but whatever. They're increasing the energy price cap from 2,500 to 3,000 next April, coupled with a £900 cost of living payment next year for those on means-tested benefits, an additional £300 for pensioners, all pensioners, and an additional £150 for the disabled, which doesn't really make sense, because if bills have gone up 500 quid and you're disabled, you get bills are going up 350 quid because you get 150 that back. Or if you're a couple, a pensioner, and there's two of you, then bills go up 500 quid, but you get 100 quid. And if you're on universal credit, you get 900 quid, so your bill goes down 400 quid, but it's already up 1,200 quid on the... It's very confusing and a bit weird. This is the weird bit that I can't quite get my head around why they're doing this and what the impact's going to be. They've kept non-dom status, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because this is likely going to be one of the political battlegrounds at the next general election. So what that means is somebody living here with a business in, say, India, which earns profits in the region of, I don't know, let's say $500 million a year, only has to pay a contribution of probably £30,000 to not have that income taxed in the UK, which saves them around about $225 million dollars a year. Now, the Conservatives are keeping this, the cynic in me says, because the Prime Minister's wife benefits from it, for one, and a load of Conservatives and their donors benefit hugely from this really curious tax break. It's a bit unique to the UK. Now, the Conservatives argue that if we don't do that, then, these people will just leave the country. But, politically, again, do we really want people here who don't pay their fair share? We're not actually going to lose that much if they do, because we'll just lose 30 grand. which, you know, if there's 1,000 of them, that's 30 million quid. Now that's like 0.01% on income tax. I think I'd be happy to pay an extra 0.01% on income tax for a fair system. They're also introducing vehicle excise duties on electric vehicles, which I'm really uncertain about, as it doesn't make sense in this world. The environment's becoming more and more important, and it's almost like they're inviting more protests with the sort of lack of attention to economic, environmental concerns. But anyway, let's have a look at some videos. This is from the Telegraph. It's really interesting.
Well, let's make no mistake, Jeremy Hunt's offering as Chancellor is completely different to what Kwasi Kwarteng, his predecessor, had suggested. I mean, this is a huge tax rise for middle income and above earners.
Which, you know, the Telegraph were like in favour of Theresa May's squeezed middle rhetoric. Personally, so was I, actually. I think, you know, there is a squeezed middle in the UK. There are some very poor people at the bottom. There's a squeezed middle. I did a video a while ago on like income distribution charts in the UK across the world, and, you know, we're fairly average in G7 nations for rich people, but middle earners and low earners are well below average. In fact, low earners are getting towards third world territory. It's pretty bad.
While at the same time being quite a big spend budget. And that will strike many people as slightly oxymoronic. You're trying to fill a black hole, and you're not only raising taxes, but also raising spending in a sort of Brownite way. This is the problem for Tories, right?
So, you know, that's interesting from the Telegraph that they're saying that Jeremy Hunt seems a bit more like Gordon Brown than a Conservative Chancellor. That's a really, I think, a powerful message to the Conservatives that they're a bit off the beaten track.
Appears to be a sort of red Tory budget. Where's the argument for voting for them come 2024? If people say, oh, actually, it's the Tories who are putting our taxes up, they can't use that traditional argument that we are the people that keep taxes low and that are better for businesses and allow you to keep more of the money in your earnings. The other interesting thing about the budget, I thought, was the fact that the word Brexit was mentioned, I think, only once towards the end when Jeremy Hunt talked about some supply-side reforms and making the most of Brexit opportunities. Many, again, will argue that this should have been something that happened as soon as Boris Johnson came into power.
Yeah, and the Telegraph saying that the government should be doing more about Brexit is, again, quite telling, because they were massively in favour of it. You know, they pumped out loads of headlines talking about no deal is better than a bad deal, which was nonsense, obviously, but because no deal was the worst deal. Well, more or less. I suppose there were worse deals that we could, but I mean, there were so on. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. The point is that they're not talking about Brexit still, because they've still got their head in the sand about it, rather than, you know, actually coming up with some. It's like the immigration thing. You know, the reason there's dinghies coming across the channel is because there's no processing centre. I mean, the simple solution, the one that people were talking about before the referendum, is we need a processing centre either in Kent or Calais, and we just need to build a massive hotel-like building to house thousands of people in and give them a safe passage. The reason that they're coming across in dinghies is because they can't just hop on a ferry or a plane or whatever. That's not a legal route to this country. You can't come to this country because you're seeking asylum. That's not a legal reason to travel to the UK, which is really weird if you think about it.
You know, a degree of deregulation, a way of maximising our separation from Brussels in a way to make us more competitive against the likes of Germany and France. I mean, as it stands, the figures are dire. The UK will have the worst economic decline in Europe next year, and by some margin. So again, you'll have Tory backbenchers frustrated that we are now 6 years out from the referendum result, and still this maximising of some of our post-Brexit opportunities doesn't appear to have materialised.
Again, that's like really telling, isn't it? That the Telegraph are saying that, you know, we've still not discovered one Brexit benefit. I mean, those of us who are Ramonas know why, because we don't think there are any. I mean, certainly. I mean, I wasn't one of these people that thought that there was no good Brexit. That there was one good Brexit, but I just thought that that was so unlikely to happen because the people campaigning for Brexit don't have the skill set to deliver it. And that was fundamentally that we somehow remain inside the EU and we strike deals with countries and we create like free economic zones somewhere in the UK where deals can be done outside of the European jurisdiction, which we kind of sort of already had with the Isle of Man and other places, but we needed that was the only. But the problem with that was that you needed a prime minister who was incredibly tactful. You needed an expert economist in the negotiating team, and like as a minister, and you needed somebody who was a really, really, really hot negotiator, somebody who could see the path to that good outcome. And the Leave campaign had none of these people, so it's just impossible to see how that could have materialised. Anyway, let's see what Beth Rigby says.
I think politically, what Jeremy Hunt has tried to do here is take the Conservative Party back onto the centre ground, acknowledging that he needs to or wants to protect NHS and education budgets, things that matter very much to the public, giving pensioners that inflation lift, giving benefits that inflation lift, giving more support to households, more vulnerable households on energy bills. So that's the nod to compassion and fairness in the budget. But in reality, what they are dealing with, if you have to take a decision, you have to have 55 billion of financial consolidation. It's massive and it's going to be painful and it's going to be felt by households up and down the country.
And that's the problem.
I'll whiz through them first.
You know, that they're trying to do austerity 2.0 to pay for all the waste, this massive waste of money that was the Johnson premiership. It was a huge waste of money. It was just billions upon billions just thrown away. And that's why, you know, as it says here in CityWire, these are like financial services tradies. So CityWire has got this great article pretty much straight away. £94 billion tax raid. That's what this is. It's you know, it's a rescue budget. I mean, in FT Advisor, this is essentially the bit of the Financial Times that's for financial advisors. Anticlimax for property, fiscal drag for taxpayers. All the country got today was an invoice. They're quoting Labour. I mean, this is the Financial Times. I mean, they're furiously centrist. Hunt's Frozen sequel has sucked out festive feels. It's quite funny. With Simone Kiriakou, she's a bit of a laugh. Government keeps state pension triple lock, which again, you know, I mean, yes, fine, but given some of their other choices, it's a bit curious. And then in money marketing, you've got industry gives mixed review to Chancellor's challenging budget. I think that's being a bit kind. I think from talking to a lot of financial advisors and financial planners, they're not happy. But you know, like I said, I think I was quoted by CityWire, but you know, I think within the Tory ideological paradigm, this is the best that you could have possibly hoped for, realistically, because their paradigm isn't built for this type of economic climate. We need something else. So I can't really see any reasons to be hopeful, if I'm being honest. There isn't really anything positive apart from the real terms increase to education. That's quite positive. The real terms increase to the NHS budget is not big enough, to be honest, because there is a lot of that we need to invest. They're cracking on with projects like HS2, which are increasingly expensive and of diminishing returns as time progresses, whilst also being really unpopular with the public, and combined with them not doing like really obvious things like making the A1 a motorway all the way up. I mean, that's just an obvious thing they should be doing. but they're not, because they're building a railway that cuts down the travel time from Birmingham to London, and that's it. They talked about Northern Powerhouse, which they've already rode back on a little bit, and I'd be surprised if that. Again, if a government promises to start something after the next general election, they're not going to do it, typically, because there'll be a new mandate set at the next general election, and that will just get forgotten. So, any promise which isn't, right, we're going to do this now, is essentially a hollow promise from a politician, fundamentally. So I can't really see that many reasons to be hopeful for the UK. So I think what I'm probably going to be doing is, over the next week, advising everybody to essentially remove any element of home bias. See, the reason you have home bias in your equity content in the portfolio is that it removes exposure from, or reduces exposure to, foreign currency risk. Because obviously if you're investing in overseas markets, you have to invest in overseas currencies. You can hedge back to sterling, but that's not a good idea typically. It's quite expensive and really just diminishes your returns. So you kind of want that exposure to foreign currency risk. That's why you invest overseas. The problem is sterling doesn't look like it's particularly strong at the moment. I can't see any reason it will get any stronger. So it's probably time to become more globalist in terms of portfolios as well. And that does mean sending out around 60, 70 reports over the next week. So I best crack on, hadn't I? But anyway, thanks for listening, watching, whatever. If you want to help support, you can do the clicky things here, or you can go to financialguidance.biz and pick up a little membership and buy me a coffee or something, which you'll find like loads of, there's an online course there, and there'll be some guides and stuff, how to budget, all that kind of stuff. Basically, how to get rich slowly. You can find all those resources there. But thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.